The penthouse was silent except for the sharp click of Victoria Chen's heels against marble floors. At 34, she'd built an empire worth $3 billion. Yet tonight, she stood alone at floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Her reflection a portrait of success wrapped in loneliness. Her phone buzzed with another message from her board of directors, the same demand they'd been making for months. The investors want stability. A family woman. Someone relatable. She laughed bitterly at the word. Relatable. As if the little girl who'd grown up sharing a studio apartment with her immigrant mother could ever forget what real life looked like. But that girl was gone. Replaced by a woman in $1,000 suits who couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her and seen anything beyond dollar signs. Victoria had exactly 30 days to change her image or risk losing the merger that would cement her legacy. The solution, according to her ruthlessly efficient publicist, was simple. Get engaged. Not for love. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford. But for optics. She needed someone genuine, someone who could soften her Ice Queen reputation without trying to control her company or access her bank accounts. Someone temporary. That's how she found herself on a Wednesday afternoon in a small diner in Brooklyn, a place so far removed from her usual world it might as well have been another planet. Marcus Thompson slid into the booth across from her, wearing a faded flannel shirt and an expression of cautious curiosity. His file sat between them. 32 years old, former architect, current freelance designer, single father to a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie. 3 months behind on rent, drowning in medical bills from his late wife's illness. He was perfect. Desperate enough to say yes? Decent enough to seem real? Let me understand this correctly, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the absurdity of her proposal. You want to pay me $200,000 to pretend to be your fiancé for 6 months? 3 months, Victoria corrected, sliding a contract across the table. The merger will be finalized by then. Public appearances, some social media presence, maybe one interview. My team will script everything. You'll be compensated weekly. Marcus didn't reach for the contract. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Nobody looked at Victoria Chen that closely anymore. Why me? Because you need the money, and I need someone who won't fall in love with the situation. She kept her voice businesslike, transactional. Your background check came back clean. You're a widower, a devoted father, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The press will eat it up, the billionaire who fell for the struggling single dad. It's a perfect narrative. Something flickered across his face. Not anger exactly, but something close to disappointment. And what does Sophie get out of this? The question caught her off guard. In all her calculations, she hadn't considered his daughter as anything more than a footnote in the story. Financial security. Isn't that what matters? No, he said quietly. What matters is that she doesn't learn to lie before she's old enough to understand why people do it. Victoria should have walked away, should have found someone else, someone less complicated. But something in his resistance intrigued her. Everyone had a price. She'd built her fortune on that principle. $250,000, final offer. Marcus looked out the window at the Brooklyn streets, at the life he was barely holding together with duct tape and determination. Then he signed the contract. The arrangement began smoothly enough. Marcus played his part perfectly at the press conference, his hand warm and calloused against hers, so different from the soft handshakes of boardroom executives. He spoke about their connection with surprising authenticity, weaving a story of chance meetings and slow-burning attraction that even Victoria almost believed. But it was Sophie who changed everything. The little girl appeared at Victoria's office on a Friday afternoon, her hand tucked into her father's, wearing a yellow dress decorated with hand-drawn flowers. While Marcus met with Victoria's publicist to coordinate their next appearance, Sophie wandered to the window where Victoria stood, mimicking her posture with 7-year-old solemnity. My daddy says you're very important, Sophie said, her voice carrying the simple honesty of childhood. Victoria didn't know how to talk to children. Quarterly reports and market analyses, yes. But this tiny human with gap-toothed smile and untamed curls? I run a large company. That's not what makes people important, Sophie replied, matter of fact. My mommy was important because she made people feel better. She was a nurse. What do you do that makes people feel better? The question landed like a punch. Victoria had built affordable housing complexes, created thousands of jobs, revolutionized sustainable urban development. But when was the last time she'd made someone feel better? When had she last tried? The staged relationship began to feel uncomfortably real in ways Victoria hadn't anticipated. Marcus insisted on cooking dinner when she worked late, showing up at her penthouse with containers of homemade soup and an infuriating refusal to be impressed by her wealth. Sophie started leaving drawings on Victoria's desk, crayon portraits labeled "The Important People I Know," always with Victoria included, even though she'd done nothing to earn that spot. "You don't have to do this," Victoria told Marcus one evening, gesturing at the meal he'd prepared in her rarely used kitchen. "The contract doesn't require actual domestic activities." He smiled, something sad and knowing in his expression. "I'm not doing this for the contract, Victoria. I'm doing it because you clearly haven't had a real meal in weeks, and Sophie would be disappointed if I let that continue." "Sophie barely knows me. She knows you more than you think. Kids see people clearly. They don't care about your net worth or your reputation. She likes you because once, when you thought nobody was watching, you stopped to help an elderly woman pick up her dropped groceries outside your building. Sophie saw that. She told me you were kind." Victoria remembered that moment, an impulse, nothing more. She'd been late for a meeting, but the woman had reminded her of her mother. It had meant nothing, except apparently. It had meant everything to a 7-year-old who was still learning what kind of person to become. The carefully constructed walls Victoria had spent 15 years building began to crack. She found herself looking forward to their scheduled appearances because it meant time with Marcus and Sophie. She started leaving her office at reasonable hours. She laughed at Marcus's terrible jokes about architecture and found herself genuinely interested in Sophie's elaborate explanations of playground, politics. Then came the night that changed everything. Victoria was working. Late, old habits died hard when her phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, and for the first time in months, her heart jumped for reasons that had nothing to do with business. "Victoria." His voice was strained. "I need help. Sophie's in the hospital. She fell at school and they think it might be appendicitis. I'm at Brooklyn Methodist, but I don't have insurance that covers—" He stopped, and she could hear the break in his voice. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called. The contract doesn't— I'm on my way." She was in her car before her assistant could ask questions, breaking every speed limit between Manhattan and Brooklyn. The hospital was a maze of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells, but she found them in a pediatric waiting room, Marcus pacing like a caged animal, fear etched into every line of his face. "The doctors are with her now," he said when he saw Victoria. "They think surgery, but they need authorization and insurance verification, and I'm trying to figure out how to—" "It's handled," Victoria said, already pulling out her phone. Within 10 minutes, she'd ensured Sophie had the best pediatric surgeon in New York and that money would never be a barrier to her care. But it was what happened next that broke her completely. While they waited for news, Marcus collapsed into a chair and finally, privately, fell apart. This man who'd held everything together through his wife's death, through poverty and uncertainty, who'd smiled for cameras and played his part in Victoria's elaborate charade, he crumbled. And without thinking, without consulting contracts or calculating consequences, Victoria sat beside him and held him. "I can't lose her," he whispered. "She's all I have left of Sarah. She's all I have, period." "You won't lose her," Victoria promised, surprised by the fierce certainty in her voice. "I won't let that happen." It wasn't until much later, after Sophie's successful surgery, after watching Marcus fall asleep in a chair beside his daughter's hospital bed, that Victoria realized the truth. This had stopped being fake somewhere along the way. She'd fallen in love with a man who measured wealth in homemade meals and bedtime stories. She'd fallen in love with a little girl who saw importance in kindness rather than quarterly profits. She'd fallen in love with the version of herself she became around them, softer, more real, more human. The next morning, Victoria tore up the contract. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, watching paper flutter into the hospital trash can. Something I should have done weeks ago, she said. Being honest. She took a shaky breath. This isn't fake anymore. Not for me. Maybe it never was. You've taught me that love isn't a luxury or a weakness. It's the only thing that actually matters. Everything I built, every success I achieved, it's meaningless if I'm too afraid to let someone actually see me. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was real and warm and everything Victoria had been too scared to want. For the record, I tore up my copy of the contract 3 weeks ago. Sophie and I discussed it. We decided you were worth keeping. 6 months later, Victoria stood at the same floor-to-ceiling windows, but the view had changed. Marcus was in the kitchen teaching Sophie how to make pancakes, their laughter filling spaces that had been silent too long. The merger had gone through, but it no longer felt like her greatest achievement. Her greatest achievement was learning that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. That vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage. That love, real love, wasn't found in contracts or calculations, but in choosing every day to see and be seen. The little girl who'd shared a studio apartment with her mother would have been proud. She'd finally learned what actually mattered.